and welcome everybody, introduce particularly Andrea, who doesn't need an introduction, to UCT and also to the set of meetings that we're having here. So this is the first of our seminars on ethics in Islam and ethics in Islam and religion. Last year we did a wonderful series, 12 lectures on ethics in intellectual traditions in Islam, and this year we are focusing on the moral economy, particularly in contemporary times, but we also have one or two papers that are going to be taking a reflective look at the past as well. So it's a great pleasure that Andrea has, I asked him last year to postpone his presentation to something that he can present this year. And I hope that you've had a chance at least to look at the paper, which has already been published, and which we have circulated for you. As I said, Andrea doesn't require explanation. I mean, an introduction, but he did send me his CV, but in Italian. So I do see something, curriculum vitae, dati personali, interessi di ricerca. I think more or less I figured out what he was saying. But I think what struck me from the CV, and I think that most of you know, but if you don't, then I would like to emphasize that there are two areas that Andrea, he really has made a significant contribution. One of them has been, I'm wondering if I should say it's been sort of as a, just as a byproduct of just being in the Lake Chad area, as a byproduct of being from Nigeria, doing work in Nigeria. And that is made a significant contribution to our understanding of radical groups, Boko Haram, and the particular crisis that exist in Nigeria. I'm saying this is a kind of a byproduct because I don't think that he perhaps intended it to be like this, but I think Duron is giving us, I think at the same time, giving us some really good insights on that area. But if one looks at his more persistent contribution, that is from, or at least from first time that I got to know him in 2007 or 8, was his work on tafsir, and particularly tafsir on radio. And so I think that his persistent and consistent work on the media and the aesthetics of Islam particularly, and the aesthetic of Islam in West Africa, really makes him one of the leading scholars in this area. So he has work on what we're going to hear today on the manuscripts, but also on the calligraphic tradition, on the mediatization of tafsir in the early part of his work, on rap on the presence of rap Islamic traditions or Islamic symbols or symbols in rap traditions, for example, and many others. I think that's sort of very focused attention on the media and on how the media shapes and how the media is shaped, by the Islamic traditions, by these traditions are very important. I hope that with this lecture, I'm going to draw him into thinking about the moral economy as well, because this particular essay that he's presenting today also looks at the trade in these manuscripts as well. So without further ado, I hope that I would like to invite Andrea to take over to do a presentation for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open for discussion. So you're welcome.
Thanks a lot, Abdul Qadir, for giving some hints about my messy CV and my messy research interests, making it sound as if it is good. It's an immense pleasure to be here with you today. I can't describe my emotions when I see on the screen next to my face Abdul Qadir, Sadia, Ala, Asonze, in this order. Just read in the order, and I just say it's a great pleasure to be here. And I look forward to very opportunities in the near future to be together again physically. I will share my screen and present my work. We have just tested it, and it did work. So there shouldn't be any problem. Can you see the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, so my title is Printed Manuscripts, which is borrowed from some work that was done on the interaction between, on the lithographies in Central Russia, Islamic lithographies in Central Russia. And it's a paper that I have contributed for a book collection that is meant at looking at various instances of overlap between the print and the manuscript tradition. So it was conceived within that kind of framework. The Nigerian manuscript, Quranic manuscript tradition has attracted some attention in the past, so I'm not, of course, the first to write about that. The focus of existing literature has been mainly on the peculiarities of the script used. So there's been some paleographic work trying to reconstruct the history of this script tradition. This is not directly interesting for us today, but perhaps one note that I will make in a few minutes will help us to, will be useful for our purposes. Of course, the original manuscripts, because this is a field that interests the growing field of manuscript studies. So the original manuscript, the piece of papers that are actually written by one scribe and that are unique, have attracted more attention than what I will look at today, which are the printed manuscripts. As Abdul Qadir introduced, the lithographies that were produced in and printed out of manuscript samples. Of course, because the manuscript studies is interested in the manuscript as an object. As a consequence, because all the Quranic studies or all the Quranic manuscripts produced in Nigeria are not signed, and it is by a scribe, for a reason that will be clear in shortly later, and because it is often difficult to date them, this tradition has been addressed as an anonymous, as a collective tradition. So these items, even these items that I look at today, those articles that have been written on the printing of the Quran usually starts from the assumption that this is what we need to explain here is a collective tradition. And so there's been less emphasis on elements of innovation, change, transformation that are more interesting for me. And nonetheless, there are many editions that exist, many editions of the Quran. They are all printed in Kano in a relatively short period from 1950s to date. They continue to be printed. And so I was I've been interested for a few years in also collecting some data about the careers of the calligraphers. There are at least 20 calligraphers whose works have been published. There are, of course, many more calligraphers who have written pure manuscripts, so to say. And there's about half a dozen of different publishers that have been involved in the business. All these publishers are based in the city of Kano. So what are my questions? Originally, in the written paper that some of you might have had a chance to look at, well, my paper was originally conceived with the following questions in mind, which are related to aesthetics and to history more than to ethics. And these are the questions. Why did Nigeria experience in the 20th century and amid the printing revolution that intuitively should have wiped out scribes and calligraphers, or at least reduced them to a marginal role in the book market, why did it experience a boom of Quranic calligraphic arts? Why was this possible? And the second question, in which ways did the introduction of new printing technologies impact an ancient craft and its established aesthetic tradition? This is where I started from. Of course, the second question you would ask me, are you sure that it impacted it, before asking, this is what Abdul Qadir yeah, this is what Abdul Qadir would ask me if we were sitting in one of his reading groups. If you ask in which ways, you mean that you're sure that it impacted. Are you sure? Well, in this case, I can say yes. And this had already been answered in a previous, in some of my previous works. I had established that it had been impacted, but I wanted to understand in which ways. Okay. So in my written paper, what I do is I summarize it for those who didn't have a chance to read it. I reconstruct in some detail the history of the Quranic manuscripts printed in Nigeria from the 1950s onwards. the careers of the calligraphers involved in the business and their relationships to publishers, printers, and readers, which for me is extremely important. The readers are an extremely important part of the book cycle. Parallel to that, always in the written paper, I propose an ethnographic section that aims at describing the techniques that underpin the study and the memorization of the Quran as practiced according to the traditional system of the region. And then I suggest that the aesthetics of the Nigerian Quranic calligraphy can only be understood in the context of the functional requirements. I'm not strictly a functionalist in terms of my approach to religion, but when I look at aesthetics, I find it useful to also adopt a functional, not necessarily functionalist stricto sensu sociological, but a functional, asking functional questions. What do certain aesthetics innovation serve? What purpose do they serve? So the functional requirements of specific teaching, learning, and reading techniques transmitted by the traditional Quranic schools of the region and embedded in the habits of the public of readers and users to whom the calligraphic items I am documenting were ultimately addressed. So this is what I do there. So what do I do today? Because I can't do the same thing. Otherwise, we just read in our sitting rooms separately and we don't meet. In this presentation, I summarize the arguments contained in the written paper, but I have the additional goal to tease out two ethical dilemmas that were faced by the ulama and the calligraphers in the process of transformation that I document, and to show the ways in which I failed to complete the sentence, but in the when I was typing, but the ways in which these ethical dilemmas triggered certain transformations. The first dilemma was related to traditional Islamic norms related to ritual purity. And the second dilemma, ethical dilemma, was had to do more directly with market ethics and market jurisprudence and the problem of copyright, for which traditional Islamic norms, as understood by the book cycle in Kano before the introduction of the printing press, did not have an answer. When I speak of a book cycle, I intend the world of calligraphers, readers, writers, of course, authors, so the ulama, and then the printing press when it comes into the picture. Although these questions, the ones on the right of our screen now, are somewhat in the background in my work so far, I hope that this discussion today will help me to tease them out further and to possibly indicate further area for future research. So a little bit of context, because I will name two poles of Islamic calligraphic tradition, so we need to locate a little bit, but I won't be long. One is Borno, an area that traditionally or in pre-colonial time encompassed, with borders that change, of course, along the century, but encompass the area of Lake Chad, so overlapping between the contemporary borders of northeastern Nigeria, northern Cameroon, southwestern Chad, and southeastern Niger. And this area has been Islamite since the 11th century and was the most important Islamic state in the Central Africa in pre-colonial times. The second area is what we can identify as Hausaland, which never existed as a political entity, but is the area of northwestern Nigeria, which where Hausa is the main language. This area has been Islamized starting from more or less from the 14th century. And I will focus especially on Kano, which in pre-colonial times was a commercial center as the one of the southern points of arrival of Trans-Saharan trade routes. So I will focus on Kano, which is indicated here. Kano, being somewhat towards the east of Hausaland, was more exposed than other parts of Hausaland to the influence of Borno, which lied to the east of Hausaland. The region I have identified with the loose term as Hausaland, as I said, never coincided with a political entity in its history, was also influenced by a major development in the political history of Islam in the region, which is the establishment of a new Islamic state called the Sokoto Caliphate in the 19th century. The Sokoto Caliphate entered into a conflict with the Borno. We are not particularly interested, but somehow we will see that there is a little bit of rivalry, we will see later, between the calligraphers of Borno and those of Kano, and perhaps this political history of competition between two Islamic states in the pre-colonial history of Nigeria also plays some role in that. So northern Nigeria became a altogether, so encompassing the southern part of the pre-colonial Borno state and most of what was the Sokoto Caliphate, plus other areas of central Nigeria, which were not part of the Sokoto Caliphate, became a British protectorate in 1903. And then at that point in 1914, and then in 1914, it was merged with the southern colony of southern Nigeria, and a new political entity was formed, which was called Nigeria, as a British colony until 1960, when Nigeria became independent. Kano and also Borno later, these are further transformation, but we're not particularly interested in this political history, became two states of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and they are so today. So let's go now straight to the ethnographic side. First point, this calligraphic tradition is rooted in a culture, in a culture of teaching the Quran and memorizing the Quran. So it has never become an independent aesthetic tradition. It is nurtured as a byproduct of a specific way of teaching and learning the Quran, which emphasizing the continuous writing of the Quran rather than the reading of the text from a page. So the Quran is learned to be written on a wooden slate. The text is deleted and it is written again until it is memorized. This, I won't enter into the details, but this is the most important thing. So learning to write properly the Quran is almost an automatic byproduct of a culture of memorization of the Quran that has been carried out for centuries in this fashion. And I give you some examples from some videos now. So basically the horizon, the technical tools of the Quranic schools are the wooden slate, the kalam, the pen, and the inks, usually natural inks, so that it allows the possibility of drinking the ink, which is a very common practice after washing off this writing, which produces, even in very young learners, as the one we will see today, a very astounding capacity of properly writing in a beautiful calligraphic style the Quran. I'll show just 1 minute of video. So basically this, at the elementary stage, was the way, not necessarily today, but has been the way in which entire generations of virtually all the people, the Muslim peoples of northern Nigeria used to have at least some elementary training of the Quran. So at least once having written and washed the Quran for a slate once, from the shortest surah in the end of the book to the longest ones at the beginning of the book. But some students, after completing this, which was required to most Muslims before they reached, or until they reached more or less puberty, And in many cultures of non-Nigeria, having completed this first reading of the Quran was a requirement to get married. After that, some used to specialize and look for further specialization in the Quran, and used to go into certain typology of schools called Tsangaya, which were especially to be found in Borno, the area of northeastern Nigeria, which we have described. So even from Hausa land, from Kano, from Sokoto, etc., if you want really to specialize in the Quran, you need to go to Borno and spend some time in the Tsangaya. The Tsangaya is usually a place that is removed from urban centers, and when students dedicate, from my ethnographic work, even 18 hours a day to the memorization of the Quran for a number of years. Just one image of the Tsangaya to just have a little bit of taste of what are the rhythms of the life in a Tsangaya. But of course, we have to extend it for many more than standard 8 hours of daily work, but about, I would say, about 18 hours a day. In a Tsangaya, when you complete the, you graduate, let's say, from a Tsangaya, when you are able to demonstrate that you can write, not recite, but write a full copy of the Quran without looking at the manuscript and without making mistakes in the vowels, in the pauses between verses, and in all the additional marks. And those who amongst you come from a Muslim background, so they know what this involves, they can understand that this is not simply memorizing the Quran, but it's something more than memorizing the Quran. This means that every graduate of the Quran will have to write a manuscript of the Quran. And this explains why there are so many manuscripts of the Quran that are produced every year by Nigerians till date. And there are so many thousands of them that can be found, because virtually it's like a diploma. So every graduate produces one. In the course of the studies in the Tsangaya, the students also live of their own, in their own cultural world, where everything is defined by the Quran. So they also develop a search for additional knowledge, which is not necessarily linked. Of course, there is some space for tafsir or exegesis or interpretation and explanation of the Quran, but the main goal of the Tsangaya is perfect memorization. So there are two additional things that a student in the Tsangaya is interested at. One is this. It is what Nigerians call the harji, and they are particularly interested in that. Harji means the statistics concerning the number of times a specific word appears in the Quran, or it appears in the Quran under one of the specific declination of the Arabic grammatical system, or in combination with different words. So a potentially infinite number of statistics. And there are some teachers in the Tsangaya system who have memorized a number of that by heart, but none of them will have the same knowledge, because these statistics are potentially infinite combination of words. And there are some students who, after having completed their Tsangaya studies, so they already know the Quran perfectly by heart, they take additional lessons into the harji. And I will show how it works. It's in Hausa, but you will, if you have some Islamic background, you might understand what this is all about.
Baddalu guda biyu ne, akwai wa ma baddalu ta badila, ni'imatallahi irin wannan sha ɗaya ce, kufuran a haka su huɗu ne.
So he said ni'matallahi, the combination between ni'ma and Allah in this particular way occurs 11 times. And you can see that the way the teacher is relating is a chant, right? He's chanting this knowledge. So it means that this knowledge is so perfectly memorized by him that does not even need to hesitate, but he puts that into a sort of chant. And the student is taking notes on his slate. We take another few seconds, because this, I think, is particularly interesting for us to understand the public of readers of the type of published items that I want to show, that it's worth dedicating a few seconds more to this.
Jahannama guda 54 ne yasalawnaha wa bisal qarar waja'alu lillahi andadan guda 6 ce wa yuzawa liyudillu an sabili,
etc. And then there's another type of knowledge that is the students of the Sangaya are particularly interested in, which are the so-called fada'il of the Quran, the uses of the Quran for practical purposes, which is opening up to the whole field, which I will not deal with today, of the talismanic arts of the Quran. So how to use specific verses of the Quran to achieve specific aims, from healing from a headache to having an easy deliverance for birth for women, to increasing his sexual power for men, to having success in business, to be protected from thieves, etc., etc. At times, these recipes that are also collected by the students of the Sangaya from a variety of teachers in infinite varieties of combinations, of course, so no teachers will teach the same recipes to his students. At times, they engage the writing of certain formulas from the Quran hundreds, if not thousands of times. So to achieve that aim, you have to write that particular verse of the Quran 100 times or 150 times. Numbers are also associated to particular values, but we're not interested into that now. And then to wash the ink from these formulas. So these at times has very funny and very ingenious effects on writing skills, because here we find students from its Sangaya system who has devised a way of joining, I think it's about 12 different pens, so that he can save time in writing the same verse of the Quran 12 times in the time he would normally spend to write one. Of course, he will have to have a perfect control to be able to write in this way without the various lines overlapping, but this is some of the astounding, I would say, writing practices that are developed in the Sangaya system. And I'll show you a little bit of that before going. So as I said earlier, the final product of the graduation from the Sangaya system is producing a text, a manuscript of the Quran that is like a diploma. And that's why we have so many of these that can be found throughout Nigeria, and they continue to produce yearly in the thousands. Some are particularly beautiful, and all of them, and I'm interested before going to another section to conclude with that, feature certain decorative marks which are not there by chance, but help the student to divide the Quran in a variety of possible ways depending on his rhythm of memorization. So how long is the section that he or she wants to memorize on that particular day, and of ritual recitation. So the markers are divide the Quran into 4 sections, into 6 sections, into 60 sections, and these are very traditional ways of dividing the Quran, and then every 60th is divided into 8s. So every 60th part is divided into 8 different parts. So you can combine these various divisions in many ways, and these marks that occur in the margins of these manuscripts always signal a certain point that has this particular purpose. On the origins of the Arabic script used in Borno and Hausa, and the last time I've checked my time, if I had included this section, I would spend more than the time allotted, so I will skip that. But in short, I believe that this is the type of script used in this region is the one that has the most archaic features amongst all the Arabic scripts that are used in the Muslim world today, is the one that is the closest to ancient Arabic scripts that were used before what the historians of Arabic paleography called the cursive revolution of the 13th century. So in my opinion, it developed in the region of Central Africa before the so-called cursive revolution of the 13th century. And that's why also historically it's very significant. But as this is a little bit more marginal to our point, I will skip this. So now, if this is the context, the calligraphers of Kano and of Hausaland that we said needed to go to Etsangaya to specialize in Quranic memorization. Their goal was memorizing the Quran, not becoming calligraphers. But in the process, because this system used to put so much emphasis on the writing of the Quran, some of them developed particular calligraphic skills. So there were a few calligraphers in Kano in the beginning of the 1900s of the 20th century. One was Rabiu Dantinki, whose Quran is shown here. One of the many copies of the Quran he has written. Estimates go between 50 and 100, but about 30 of them have been collected by his family after his death, because at that time he wasn't publishing them. It's before publishers, so he used to write for people who used to buy a Quran for him. So I want a Quran by him, I go and buy. So after his death, his sons went back to some of the people who had bought Qurans from him and bought them back and collected about 30 of his Qurans. So I think that already in the 1900s, there were some elements of innovation amongst Quranic calligraphers in Kano, but these are very difficult to trace. So I will focus on the elements of innovation that are prompted by the market and by the ethical demands of the market, or by new ethics that comes with the market. So I will skip that. Kano in the late colonial era, so we move to the, let's say, the 40s. Kano in the late colonial era has a big economic development. Intuitively, a city whose whose wealth in pre-colonial times was due to its position in the trans-Saharan trade routes would have had to die out after the colonial times, because this meant that the trans-Saharan trade died. But Kano somehow was able to, was reintroduced, in fact, by the British, reframed into new trade routes that now reoriented trade from the trans-Saharan route to the Atlantic. So now Kano became the place where the Kano traders started to stock the agricultural product of the north. On the left, you see the famous groundnut pyramids. They became famous in the colonial time. So we have this big development, and Kano becomes the center where the agricultural product of the northern region of colonial Nigeria is stocked and then goes to the ports of Lagos and Port Harcourt in the south. So Kano actually has a huge commercial development. Parallel to this development, not caused by this development, but in my opinion, strictly linked to this economic and commercial development, is a boom in a specific Sufi Tijani network that has its center in Kano. And some of the scholars who led this network are represented to the right. We don't need, they are Tijanis, they are members of the Tijaniya, and they develop a boom that has also important implication in the culture of literacy. So basically, in the 1950s, we have this context in Kano, where we have an increase in the public of readers, thanks to the popularization of the Tijaniya, to which the Qadiriya responds. So there is some sort of also competition between different Sufi orders at the time. And both try to write. They write a lot. There is a boom of literacy. They produce an astounding quantity of writings, especially poetry in Arabic and in Hausa. We have the establishment of the first printing enterprises in Kano under colonial rule. And we have the fact that the readership of the region is not familiar with the Eastern Arabic script, the one we are familiar with today, which is the one that is available for movable type printing. So if you have to print a book in Arabic, if you print it with the characters that are available with movable print and coming from the Middle East, people would not read it. They are not used to that because they are trained in those Quranic Sangaya system, which we are, I mean, the Arabic readers are trained in that script. So of course they could have developed the technology for movable type printing in the local script. But what happened was a different thing. was that the writers, the Tijani and Qadiri writers, to market their writings, relied on offset lithographies. So they started to hire the old scribes who used to be available in the thousands, because we've seen what type of culture of writing was there. So they hire them, they write a beautiful sample of a writing, and then this writing is reproduced in lithographies and marketed. And so we have this paradox that the introduction of new technologies leads to a boom of the apparently ancient craft of calligraphers. Can Ala perhaps tell me how many minutes do I have?
Well, Prof. Tayyub's supposed to indicate this, but I think maybe 10 minutes.
You've got about 10 minutes, but you can go a little bit longer if you like.
Maybe 15, maybe I will use 15.
Yeah, sure.
So this leads to a first ethical dilemma. Some of the printing enterprises in Kano, the first printing enterprises in Kano, are owned by Southerners, non-Hausa people. And they are often not Muslims, or they are Muslim Yorubas, but they hire non-Muslim workers. So the concern is these non-Muslims will handle the writing that is considered as sacred. So this prevents this printing industry to affect the Quran. This is a dilemma that scholars and calligraphers overcome quite easily. They do the most intuitive thing that they would do. So they enter into the printing business themselves. They start to learn the techniques and they start to take ownership of printing businesses in Kano. And then we will move to the second one. The second dilemma comes when someone starts to print the Quran. For some years, the scholars, usually the Tijani and Qadiri scholars, were in control of this first printing industry to lithographies. They refrained from printing the Quran because of these concerns with purity, etc. But then comes in a businessman called Dantata. If you've heard about the who's who of Africa, today you will know about Dangote, the richest man in Africa, who is Nigerian from Kano. Dantata is, I think, the uncle of Dangote, or the grandfather. I should check. I can't remember now. So Dantata is a businessman, very active businessman. He's also linked to some Muslim scholars of the Tijaniya at the time. But basically, he understands that there is a huge market for the Quran in the local script. So he had a private copy of the Quran written by a calligrapher called Dambaballe. This calligrapher had been paid by his father, by the father of Dantata, the customary wage that was paid to the calligrapher to produce one copy. Dantata decides to take his copy of the Quran. He brings it to London. And in the 1950s something, I'm not sure about the date yet, because there were many editions of this Quran, so I've not been able to establish which one is the first. He has it printed in hundreds of thousands of copies in London, brings it back to Kano, to Nigeria, and he floods the market with this. As all the Qurans that were produced by calligraphers at the time, the Quran written by Dambaballe didn't feature the name of the calligrapher. So the publisher has the full copyright of his, so Dantata has the full copyright of the copy of the Quran and makes a lot of money. Dantata, I want to be fair, was also very generous to the family of Dambaballe. The sons of Dambaballe are still living in a house that was purchased by Dantata for them, but still, the publication of, at the sale in the market of lithographs of a copy of the Quran written by a calligrapher without the mentioning of his name and without the fair copyright being paid to him, of course, raises a new set of questions that have to do with market ethics and market jurisprudence. I'll go back to it now. But in the process, the Dantata edition triggers a set of chain reactions. Basically, what happens is that first, the scholars were also the publishers, the ulama were the publishers in the Islamic book market at the time. They say, oh, now a businessman who is not a scholar, who is not from the ulama, has come into the business and has done something we had never done before. So we should go into the business of printing the Quran themselves. Number two, the calligraphers. The calligraphers say, okay, now one copy of the Quran we write will not be used by the purchaser for his devotional reading at home. It will be used to be printed out in lithographies and be sold in literally hundreds of thousands of copies. So they will make a lot of money. So we need a better share. Some of the calligraphers cannot bargain too much with the publishers, because the publishers, as I said, are the ulama. The publishers and the calligraphers are usually students of the ulama. So they are in that very delicate relationships where they can't bargain too much. And I will show you why the one who really brings this business to a new dimension is the person he is. But basically what happens is also that more Qurans are being printed, there is competition. And so a number of Qurans, I will just show the picture now and move to a specific calligraphers for 5 minutes. Most of there are so many, each of them is different because of course the market needs different editions and there is an enhanced competition. Each edition needs to feature something that is slightly different from a previous one. So there is this innovation, but this innovation is always restrained by the functional requirements of the public of readers, which are the ones that I've described before. I just go through these images just to give a sense of what is published between the 50s and to date. And before I move to Sharif Balaghabari. Sharif Balaghabari was one of such calligraphers. At that time, all the publishers were Tijanis. Sharif Balaghabari was a Qadiri. And I think it's not by chance that the calligrapher who in a more efficacious way than any other calligrapher was able to emancipate himself from the publishers was not a Tijani, because he was not linked to this very delicate student-teacher relationship that existed between most calligraphers and publishers. So basically what he does is he takes control of the full cycle. He's a calligrapher, he's a printer, he's a publisher. He becomes so through the years. But there are also other reasons why his Qurans become so celebrated, and his Qurans are the most famous ones and the most beautiful ones produced in Nigeria from the 60s when he started to 2016 when he died. The first is he develops a style that it enhances the regularity and the angularity of the traditional manuscripts. So it is innovative in a sense. And I think that angularity was a conscious choice, because the more it is angular, the more it resembles to the original Kufic, which was the origin of the calligraphic tradition of Borno, or at least the claimed origin. And the fact that it is regular, it looks more like a printed Quran. There is more regularity in the size of the letters. Number two, of course, the quality of the traditional geometric designs that separate, as we've seen, the various sections of the Quran for memorization or for ritual recitation purposes. And one that is very interesting for us, if we go back to the culture of the Tsangaya, which is the public of readers, is the precision of the division between each hizb and the following one. Hizb is 1/60th of the Quran. It is the most important division of the Quran used for memorization purposes, that is signaled in the Nigerian tradition by these circles that you see. Now, to explain that, we see for a second this slide. On the left, we have, now we have to say these hizb are not exactly the same as each other in length. There is some differences. So what happens is that if one calligrapher wanted to separate one hizb for another, he had to do what the picture on the left shows. So he had to leave a few lines blank at the end of one hizb and before the beginning of the other. Now, Sharif Bala had such a perfect memorization of the Quran that he was able to write his Quran in a way in which, by adjusting the size of the letters in a very imperceptible way, you don't notice that he's adjusting it, he makes every hizb ending at the exact spot at the bottom of a page, which is very difficult to do. As I've said, the sizes are not the same. So this is very interesting for the users, because as I've said, the users of these editions are the public of the Sangaya. And then another issue before I go to the conclusion, I'm very close to the conclusion. So it's the marginal notes. Every edition of the Quran published by Sharif Bala features different marginal notes, which are the ones that we see in red in this copy. And what are these marginal notes about? They are exactly about those additional knowledge about the Quran that the Sangaya public is so interested in. The Harji, the statistics. If you're interested in the question and answer session, we can look at some of them, but just it is Harji. It is these statistics about how many times a specific combination of words occur in the Quran. And they are the Fadail, how to use verses of the Quran for talismanic, let's say, practical purposes. So he's very successful. Now, if this is what happens in Kano, and we now conclude with the second ethical dilemma faced by the scholars, what was happening in Borno? Borno was the original center of Quranic calligraphy in Nigeria, as I had said. Here we have a different response to the ethical and normative dilemmas imposed by the printing industry onto the calligraphic craft, almost an opposite response. So the calligraphers of Borno resist to the idea of printing Quranic manuscripts. They simply refrain from doing so. They insist on an ethics of sacred calligraphy that labels the signing of a Quran as unethical. Basically, the reasoning is if you put your name in a Quran as a calligrapher and then you publish it, you are not going to get the rewards from God that the writing of the Quran is supposed to bring about unto you. So you're basically, as one would say in an Islamic lexicon, spoiling your niyyah, spoiling your intention. So they refrain from doing so. They continue to publish so many Qurans because, as I've said, they continue to study in Sangaya. They produce so many Qurans as diplomas. But either they produce them so as average quality Qurans as at the completion of memorization, or when they specialize as calligraphers, they produce them as luxury items. And of course, purchasing an original manuscript copy of the Quran is much more expensive than buying a lithographed copy. So the Borno scholars calligraphers continue to do only that. If you want to buy my copy, you need to buy an unicum copy. You need to come by me, ask me, and I'll write one for you. But of course, you'll have to pay. So they also make money. They're not, they're not stupid, right? They're also making money, but in a different way and without entering into the logic of the mass market that was influencing the Kano arena so much. So they also become they do not acquire the same fame of the Kano junior partners. These are some examples of, let's say, luxury items, luxury Qurans, which can be purchased by Borno scholars in original copies still today. So my conclusions is the Quranic calligraphy tradition of Nigeria, I forgot that, is one of the most ancient ones, and probably, I would say certainly, but I don't want to be as Nigerios or to appear as Nigerio-centric as I really am, but probably the most attractive one of Africa south of the Sahara. It is rooted in a scribal culture that relies on what is probably the Arabic script style with the most archaic features among the ones that are used today in the Muslim world. This tradition has been able not only to survive, but even to thrive after the introduction of the printing industry. The introduction of the printing press has impacted the calligraphies of two sub-regional poles of Islam in Nigeria in opposed ways. The calligraphers of Kano have responded to the ethical challenges imposed by the printing industry, basically by embracing its logic and enhancing competition and innovation. So the flamboyant printed Qurans that are slowly becoming quite famous, even amongst non-West African Muslims today, are the product of the logic market. And I must say, they appear to me as less traditional as they appeared to me the first time that I came across them. I see the elements of innovation more. The calligraphers of Borno, on the contrary, have remained attached to older ethical norms and refuse the market economy. In terms of aesthetics, the two different responses to the same ethical dilemma have produced two different effects. We have a relative innovation in styling Kano, always within the boundaries of the functional requirements, which for me are very important to define the aesthetic horizon of these items, because a Quran must obey to certain characteristics to be marketable in that context to the Sangaya public, while emphasis in Borno is on continuity and consistency, and the Borno calligraphy in this context, in this moral economy, has become more a niche, luxurious art tradition. I think I can conclude here. I hope I have raised some questions that can keep us busy for a few more minutes with a questions and answers session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It was a really wonderful journey and also interesting narrative that you sketched for us. Really thank you for taking the time to lay it out and also introduce us, and just right from the beautiful maps that you shared with us in the beginning, situated the context, and then also taking us through this wonderful culture, this wonderful tradition. I think that you've raised some really interesting questions on, the calligraphic tradition, the Hifz tradition, the memorization, the Sangaya that you said, as well as the commercial, if I can call it, kind of a commercial side of it as well. So I think we can take questions on all of these different areas, because it might be things that people want you to emphasize some, but we invite everybody just to, if you have a question, please raise it, and just keep your questions and your comment brief, and let Andrea tell us a little bit more about this tradition. I think I've already seen two. So Sadia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Andrea, for a wonderful presentation, and for these very interesting differences in terms of what's happened in Kano and Borno. So could you give, unless I missed it, could you give us a sense of what do you think are the factors that kind of enable Borno to remain more kind of, clear about a certain kind of niyyah and about the anonymity of this, of the work, versus Kano that follows a more kind of commercial logic? I'm asking, what do you think are the underlying factors that pushed in these two very different directions within these two contexts?
Thank you, Sadia. This is a very interesting question. I think, if I may be allowed, I'm not sure if there's Kano or Borno people in the audience, but I'm sure that they would agree that what I say reflect what are internal perspectives about this issue. So if I were to ask, or when I asked this question to a Borno scholar or a Borno person, the Bornoans would have said, oh, the Kano people are too, because Kano is a commercial center and there's more wealth, etc. The Kano people are too world-oriented. They're too much interested in money. But if I ask the question to the Kano people say the Bornoans are just jealous. Because they're just jealous because they have lost grounds and they can now, I'm sorry, I'm not claiming, yeah, I need the disclaimer. If there's a Borno here, I'm not taking the sides of Kano, but I'm just relating what the average Kano calligrapher would say. Of course, they would say that they owe everything to the Borno scholars because that's where they learned their art. But they would also say, perhaps in a conversation, that after all, the Borno calligraphers are a bit jealous. So the only way they can still claim the ownership of the tradition after such a big development that occurred in Kano is by claiming, oh yes, but we refrain from publishing it. So of course there's a lot of joke. In fact, there's a joke in relationship between the Kano and the Borno people, and they are allowed to do that. But I think that really position in the economic networks of contemporary Nigeria really made a difference. To make things a little bit bit more nuanced, we must say that the first effort that the Borno scholars are recently trying to catch up with innovations, if we want to say that, because in 2018, the first effort to develop a digital font on this writing, so for this script, has been made by the Bornoans, the people of Borno, and they have printed the first Quran digitally printed. So it's a font that has been created. It's not a writing, but the font has been created out of the handwriting of one Bornoan scholar, and it has been printed by the government of one of the Nigerian states that borders Borno and that basically culturally belongs to Borno. So it's a Bornoan product. So they are catching up in a way with innovation, not with quality.
Thank you so much. Professor Brian Larkin, welcome.
Thanks for joining, Brian.
No, thank you for this talk.
Honored to see you.
It's just a wonderful talk to listen to, honestly, as so much of your work is. I had just one question, which is really about that moment where you identify angularity and regularity. But when Kanawa began to make these Qurans and print them, they began to mimic the angular style of the written Quran, and they began to mimic the print through the regularity of spacing and through the nature of the letters. So I guess my question is, I can understand why you might want to mimic the authority of an ancient tradition. What's the authority of print in this that you seek to also mimic this? And would there be an ethical debate about that? Do you sort of treat, you say there are various controversies, but the becoming of print, in this case at least, doesn't seem to be a controversy, where obviously elsewhere it has been. And I think of this partly because in my own work, the first printing press was in Kaduna, and the first newspaper was printed by the British, and they used Northern Nigerian scholars, and they would print in English, in Hausa in Roman script, and Hausa in Ajami script. And in the very first article, they say this is an experiment. It's done on the new printing presses. They invite everyone to come and see the printing press. So they're staging the logic of print as part of the colonial proffer of infrastructural development. So it has a particular colonial history and authority. So I just wondered if any of this feeds in, because one could imagine there could have been a strong resistance to print, and then why were people trying to copy print?
This is another extremely interesting question. So you said the angularity that imitates the former authority of the Kufic is fairly straightforward to understand, if I got your point. But why should one feel that they have to imitate the regularity of the print? My interpretation is very tentative on this, and I'm based on the point of angularity. I was based on my interview with the scholar who actually said, I want to imitate the Kufic. I mean, no, he didn't say I want to imitate the Kufic, sorry. He said, I had a dream where the Prophet inspired me to write in a way that is more similar to the original Kufic, because our writing comes from there. That's what he said, more or less. And so, yes, there is this authority of the angularity. As far as this angularity is concerned, this is not something that has come across the author himself, to be frank, but it has come from the public. So the users, to whom, just in formal conversations, I often ask, why do you think that the script of Sharif Bala is better than the other ones? And I ask it to so many people, and many of them would say, because it is more regular. The size of the letter is more similar to each other, so it looks more like a printed version. Now, I have to be frank, and so I have to be careful that this regularity might not, in imitating the print, might not have been intended by the author, but I have met it, I've encountered it as an additional aesthetic appeal that was. So for me, the bottom line is that these ones by Sharif Bala, more than others, of course, along with others, but more than others, they really encapsulate this moment of time, this lapse of time where the public of Islamic readers in northern Nigeria was exposed to a manuscript culture and a print culture together. And the ones by Sharif Bala brought them together somehow. Maybe this sounds a bit magic, but I think there was something magic in Sharif Bala. And I think this is very, can be, in fact, I can perhaps rely on what you are doing, because by showing those are the examples that are not necessarily from strictly Quranic writing or strictly Islamic writing, but to writing that was circulating, you show the same overlap of the writing culture and the printing culture, which is what Nigerians are for the first time seeing together. And then this comes in and somehow within the Quranic spheres encapsulates both dimensions in a new way. I'm not sure this has answered your questions, but usually good questions are the ones that that you start thinking and that perhaps you need more time to answer. So I'll be happy to continue the conversation in the future about this.
Thank you so much. I want to just, I think there are a few other hands up there. So I think I saw Uwais, if I have the order correct. Yes. Uwais Rafidin.
Hello, sorry, Prof.
Yeah, I just lost my sort of screen. I was just trying to make sure that I have that you were the next person.
I don't think so. I think Brian Maxey is before me.
Okay, all right, yes, sure. All right, I just lost some screen of mine. Okay, Brian, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. This was an amazing talk. Thank you, Professor Brigaglia. Thank you, Professor Tayob, for this. So just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a PhD student, American-Canadian at the University of Toronto. This was an amazing talk. Thank you so much. A lot of my work is indebted to you, Professor Brigaglia, so this is where I wanted to ask my question. In your paper, thank you so much for pre-circulating. You talk a bit about the Yoruba tradition and how there's some work done and how it's connected to the Bornoan tradition of scribal tradition. So I'm just curious to what extent you see connections there as well. And if you have any tips, this is the area I'm focusing in on where I can explore more. I have a few references, but just wanted to see how much there's continuity in different places across the Nigerian context. Yeah, other ones about antiquity, but I don't think we have enough time. So I just want to thank you again in any context for Yoruba land in relation to the Sangaya, the scribal tradition, and also just the manuscripts culture there as well.
Thanks, Brian. This is also one of those questions that I might not be able to answer satisfactorily. At my knowledge, there is one published article on the Yoruba calligraphic tradition. And if you don't have access to it, please contact me via email and I'll send it to you because you might find something there. What appears from that published article really overlaps with the Kano tradition a lot, with the Kano Borno tradition. This would make sense because Yoruba, from the point of view of the Quranic culture, has been a little bit more indirectly than Kano, but also under the influence of Borno, but a little bit more indirectly because you would find a lot of scholars from Yoruba land who would actually go to Kano, but if they would go to Kano or Zaria, they would be trained by scholars who, at least in the field of Quranic memorization, not on other fields of knowledge, would be trained by Bornoans. But of course, history is much more deep than the 20th century, and the article that I have in mind focuses also on the 20th century. So if you're interested in that article by I think Soleimani is the first name, Soleiman something, I can send it to you. Yeah, definitely, I have been a bit Kano-centric, I admit. That's my original sin. And Yoruba land is another area of development of Islamic and calligraphic cultures in Nigeria that must have, I'm sure it has some peculiarities. I'm sure it does have, although from the published article, I tend to see it more as a sort of belonging to the same tradition. Hello, Shamil. Uwais was first, but I can see Shamil. Uwais.
Thank you so much, Brian. Uwais, please go ahead.
Okay. Thanks a lot for a fantastic talk, Andrea. It strikes me that, you know, that how something is learned is equally as important as what is learned and its, you know, eventual functions. And similarly, this emphasis on the beauty of the Quran and writing it in a beautiful manner is as important as the content and the harji and the fadail and so on. I don't know if I got it right there. I'm thinking here, of course, of the notion of adab and, the whole culture being focused on adab and rather than ilm. Am I right in that, number one?
Absolutely.
And if I am, could you expand on that a bit, the whole howness of the process, Andrea? Thank you.
Absolutely. The adab or etiquette of learning is foundational in this process. I know you have, I've missed it. I know you have had a presentation on the working Quran by Rudolf Ware some time ago in this series, which really focuses a lot on that, and didn't really expand on the etiquette of learning in my presentation. But I also think, so it has to do with ways in which the Quranic word is, internalized or embodied through practices of not only memorizing, but also drinking, etc. But I also think that at times this etiquette did create a conflict, so a problem. And I'm not saying I'm against the etiquette. Of course, I love a lot of these parts of the etiquette and I like to do ethnographies about that. But it did create a problem when the calligraphers were somehow prevented by the adab who were supposed to show to the teachers, who were also the publishers, were prevented by that to claim their due in financial terms when the printing of the Quran turned the art of the calligrapher into such a successful business. And I'm not saying this means that the adab was wrong, but I'm saying this means that the relationships needed to be reframed by taking into considerations also other sorts of ethics, the market ethics. And that's why I think I failed to develop a bit more on that because I was rushing towards the conclusion. But I think it's not by chance that Sharif Bala, the one who was able to enter into, to bring the book cycle into his end, I have full control of the book cycle by becoming a calligrapher and the printer and the publisher at the same time, was not a Tijani, but was a Qadiri, because all the publishers at that time were Tijanis. And so for a Tijani, all the other calligraphers were also Tijanis. So a Tijani calligraphers would find it difficult to, bypass the relationship of adab, of etiquette that he needs to have to a publisher who is a Tijani and who is perhaps also his sheikh, and become independent from him. Whereas Bala, by being into the Qadiri tariqa, which was less active into the printing sector, as a calligrapher, found a way to develop more quickly. I hope this partially answers your questions. Thank you so much, because it raises a whole new set of important issues.
Shamil, thank you very much. Please go ahead, Shamil.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can see you in here.
Yeah. Good to see you, Andrea.
So good to see you.
Thank you so much. Always fascinating to hear you on this topic and see your images. Yeah, I mean, we've spoken a lot about this and seen some of this in practice in Kano. But can you say something about temporality, how long it takes to produce a copy of the Quran? I mean, can you establish that? Have you established that? Because if you're talking about the economy of this area, it relates to how many you can produce in X number of months or what period. If you're a calligrapher, and on top of that, what are the protocols of checking and correcting, because mistakes are made.
Yes.
And so that is not only ink and pen, it's also having something to rub out things and to put in corrections. I mean, we know from other calligraphers how they paste on a page. So you know, do you can you say something about that, because there's an important element there that's got to do with economics, but also just with adab, with ritual, with time and stretching, and a question of materiality is, where did the paper come from? We know that there was never a paper production in West Africa, particularly in the time that I work on, but even you know, under the British, there was no paper production. So is there a kind of standard by which you discuss the quality and the weight of paper? I think Kano in the 60s, probably, Kano had a famous printing works, but I don't think there were attempts in Nigeria in the 60s to develop a paper manufacturing industry. But it's all imported. And if there were ever discussions about the quality of paper that you use, you know, there's one quality of paper for writing school books and one quality of paper when it comes to writing out a mushaf. Wow. I mean, lots more questions, but I leave that for a trip to Kano. Thank you.
These are very Shamili questions. Questions from someone who is into the manuscript studies and material culture of writing, material history of writing field. So I'll try to be brief. Time. Yeah, that's it. I have data from interviews, and in fact, can I publicly thank Dahiru, who has joined from Napoli now, who was in Nigeria at the time I was finishing this paper. I was unable to travel to Nigeria. So for some additional interviews that I needed for this paper, I relied on the help of Dahiru, who is now a student at L'Orientale of Napoli, and of Sani, who is a student, who was a PhD student at UCT. And they were both in Kano, so they helped me with some very precious interviews. So I have data from most of the calligraphers about how many times did it take them to write a Quran. And I have some of the recent ones whose pictures, the images of whose Qurans you have not seen in this presentation, some of the most recent works. Some, for instance, make it a matter of pride of being able to produce a Quran in a very fast time. So publishing 3 every year. This is made by one of the recent ones. So he has been able to publish 3 Qurans in 1 year. And he says he saves a lot of time by asking other people to do the voweling. Some of the students add the vowels. And so he produces 3, which means that, you know, because there's also the checking process, etc., which means that in a couple of months, he's finished 1. And another one, an interview yesterday on a WhatsApp phone conversation with one of the authors who are active today, he tells me, one of the peculiarities of my writing is that I'm in no rush. I take 1 year to complete 1 Quran. So you can see here that, and they're both from Kano, they're both into the same business, but you can see here that there is 2 different approaches. One tends to almost present it as a matter of pride to be very fast, and the other one does the exact opposite. But I would say anything that goes from 2 months, but an average of a few more months. For instance, the Borno calligrapher who produced this copy, it took him 3 months. 3 months to complete this copy, which, however, doesn't have a lot of additional notes, etc. And then the paper, yes, the matter of the issue of the paper in pre-colonial times, it used to come from Italy mostly. Right, so most of the paper that we find in the actual manuscripts is of Italian import, especially from northeastern Italy, and there's a lot of that, and there's some work on that. More recently, scholars who publish, for instance, this one, the one I'm showing now, it's an Indian make. It's made in India, which is considered by some calligraphers to be relatively cheaper, but still providing some relatively good qualities that can be used for unicum manuscripts. And then, of course, there is the printing for the lithographic copies, which is very cheap paper. It's very cheap paper imported, I believe, from the Arab world, but I would have to check. This is the one that is used for the copies, the mass production of copies that are lithographed and marketed. Of course, we'll continue to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Andrea, if I could ask you, I could come in a little bit more on the moral economy side of it, because I think that, I mean, you've set up, even in your response to Shamil, you've actually opened up questions about, you know, a lot of people working and a lot of people supporting, you know, this economy side. So perhaps one of the questions that that came to my mind, maybe just as a concrete way of getting into the subject, is that I sort of noticed perhaps a kind of a gap between, you know, how you are reading this Quran in order to memorize, because it's somehow the young kids are still learning this, you know, through a lawh. On the other hand, you know, when these manuscripts are written, for example, how are they recited? Who is, what are people doing with them? What is the actual demand? Are they putting them like myself, I'm putting them on a shelf, or are they, you know, are these becoming, you know, potentially art pieces? I'm sort of thinking about that kind of economy that is building up here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Qadir, for the question. In fact, of course, there was no time to expand on everything. And in fact, on this, I didn't really mention much even in the written paper, which I could have done. But they are indeed used. They're indeed used in the Quranic schools, because once the printed Quran is available in a relatively cheap way, then every mosque will have one or a few, not one, but a few. So a few of them are found in the shelves of the mosques, which are also the Quranic schools. So they are used for number one, of course, for the learning practice. So you still write on a lawh, but you check against a printed manuscript copy. And the fact of not checking against a printed copy that is imported from the Middle East is, of course, linked to the issue of the script that I've mentioned many times. So the script is a different one. So we want it in our script. And they're used also for, you know, daily recital and rehearsing of memorization by people who are not in the Quranic school anymore. So they don't use the lawh, but they have to rehearse the memorization or do their ritual memorization. The fact that is an important detail which I failed to mention is that these Qurans, even when they're printed, they're never bound. The page is always left loose, because this allows people to divide them easily into several portions. For instance, I go to Joe work and I have the practice of reciting 1/60th of the Quran every day, or 1/8 of 1/60, or 1/2 of 1/60. So I bring that section with me to my office, and when I have a break, I recite it, and then I bring them home, and I took a separate one. Or another thing, very useful, that these Qurans are not, are always kept unbound, is when I have a function, like a birth of someone, or a wedding, or the death of someone, then I have guests in my house and I have a few copies of these printed Qurans, and then ask for a recital of the Quran to be done by the group for the blessings on the occasion that is being celebrated or commemorated or whatever. So I take these copies and I divide them in equal portions, always using these signs that easily allow me to identify the breaks, and I give them to the 100 people or the 150 or the 40 people who are in that room, and I give them in more or less equal portions. So in 20 minutes, half an hour, everyone reads a section, and it's as if we have, and then we have read the whole Quran. So this ritual culture, side by side the memorization culture, is also makes those particular divisions very, I would say, functional, which is in no way an attempt to be a reductionist in this case, but it is to understand the particular development of an aesthetics based on what are the real uses that are being made of these items. So thanks, Abdul Qadir, because you allowed me to say something about this idea of not binding the papers, which is very important for the Nigerian public. And Dahir has raised his hand, so maybe he wants to add something on this, or perhaps on something else.
Go ahead, Dahir. I see you've made a lot of comments, but please go ahead.
Okay. I'm not going to ask any question, but I just want to make a comment because Professor Shamil asked about issue of checking mistakes. I think Professor Andrea answered this.
I forgot, yes.
Yes,
you do that for me.
Yes, the issue of checking, I know that Andrea system is very systematic organization. They have a system of hierarchy system started from the one who write the Quran, started from the Buris up to Gwani, which means the expert of the Quran. So usually when someone wrote a Quran, so he took the copy, he has to take the copy and bring it to the expert, and they are going to go through it and give him some observations. But still, there are many mistakes that sometimes appear in some Quranic copies in the market. So I can remember that when I went to one of the calligraphers with Sani in our interview, he tackled this problem and told us that now they started something with Nigeria or Kano state government in order to reduce this problem. They are going to establish some committee of some Quranic expert that before you print or introduce your Quran into the market, you must give it to this committee and approve it. And of course, they started this one by sending some of their Quran to Saudi Arabia, and one of the, I think, the Ministry of Endowment of Saudi Arabia approved one of the Quran that have been written in. The second issue I want to just talk about is about time of writing. That also some calligraphers like Sharif Bala used to write the time they spend in the writing their Quran. For example, in the Quran that I think you showed the example, but I have it here with me because in the system I used to take it anywhere I'm going because I cannot read with the printed one. So this Quran actually was written between August 2006 and September 2007. So it looks like almost more, but I think this it took this long time because Sharif Bala wrote it in very it was in the late of his age, so he's very old and he has many issues to attend to. So maybe this is why he took almost 1 year and something like that. So this is just what I am going to add.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Andrea, you want to comment on that, or you want to maybe one or two other questions? We're coming.
Well, thanks a lot to Dahir for adding these explanations and these details. Thanks a lot.
Maybe I want to come back to the moral economy, what we've been trying to do. So I want to, not because I think you've given us a really good, perhaps also invitation for some of the younger students who are here also to look at these questions. So in a way, I mean, I want to pick up this kind of ethical questions. In particular, you mentioned that the Quran that was taken to Europe, for example, or to London to be reproduced, I'm sure that they were not asking the questions about whether this is pure or not, right? So I want to use that as a basis. I mean, do you think that as a basis of thinking about the questions? Because I mean, the argument that some scholars are making is that when you come into the market economy, I mean, there's a sort of a sense in which values and ethics that are related to certain taboos or certain kind of rules would have to be suspended. Like, you're only mentioning one, but perhaps the other one might be that who do you pay, who receives payment, and it's on both sides. It's both the side of the way that you described it, the student who expects, who feels that maybe he should be paid because somebody else is making a lot of money from the manuscript, whereas previously, that's not necessarily in the picture. So once you bring in
absolutely
money, so I'm just wondering whether I think that maybe this idea that this is a market economy in Kano as well as a more traditional economy in Borno, for example, or in the Borno region, needs to be a little bit more looked at a little bit more carefully, so that we can begin to see, what is the kind of economy.
Absolutely, you are pointing to the right to some very crucial issues, and that edition, which I've now shown, I'm now showing again. It raised another problem, but I decided not to focus on this on my presentation because I'm not really sure that this was the case. But number one, in answering your questions, I have to say that definitely this was not handled by Muslim people, because it was printed in London in the 50s, and there's no way in which the publisher could make sure that the handling would be done by Muslims, right? There's no way. Still, and that there's no way this would not be controversial amongst the top ulama, but there's also no way in which this could not impact the market and trigger a revolution, because it was so important, it was so new to have this Quran available in the local script in full and with colors, because it's important also that it has colors, because colors are very important in this manuscript tradition. So you can print it in colors. It's so cheap if compared to one single manuscript copies that it could not impact. So absolutely, it led to a lot of questions, but I think in this case, market was more powerful than ethics. Because, I mean, it brings so many advantages that you have to, and along the same years, more or less in the same years, 10 years before, actually, there was a debate about whether you can recite the Quran on the radios in Nigeria, which was a very similar one. In fact, the JAS has published an article many years ago by Muhammad Sani Omar on this issue. So it was about 10 years before the printing issue. So these are also very closely linked. But another thing happened, which I haven't mentioned. This edition is called the May Belt edition because the pages used to be left unbound as per the local tradition, and then they used to be wrapped by a belt with a clip. So May Belt in Hausa means the one with a belt. Now, traditionally, the manuscript copies of the Quran and even of other books used to be wrapped by a leather strip, which is to be tied. Now, I find that this idea of the belt is never really, after the 50s, dies out. And I've been wondering why. They develop other ways, like more like a classic button, where you close the cover with a button, but you don't need a belt. And I have one hypothesis which would be fascinating, but as it is something that I'm just developing out of my own, and no one in Nigeria has confirmed it, that one reason why the belt led to some ethical dilemmas is that the belt in the 50s in Nigeria was a sign of Western culture. Wearing a belt, in fact, there's a word that in Hausa is zanzaro, which means the wasp. The people who used to wear a shirt with a belt and trouser used to be mocked. You know, you are dressing as a wasp. You know, the wasp whose waist is tied. Yeah. Because this is a sign of being, you know, a kind of young, westernized male who wants to emphasize his sexuality and look different from the more modest outlook of a man dressed in a traditional robe. This was the way in the, now it's of course very different, but I've always been wondering why the idea that this Quran was a made belt, that it had a belt, because this was in the 50s. And in the 50s, we find like Hausa poems that mock people who are wearing a belt because it looks so un-Islamic. That I've been wondering, but I want to be cautious, so I don't want to put it into writing anymore. If this could be a connection between this idea, this association of the item belt as an item that signified westernization and hypersexualization of males, and that it was not considered as part of the etiquette to associate it with the Quran. I don't know if Dahir, who's from Nigeria, says that I'm really going too far off with this speculation, or there's any sense in that.
Wait, we have before I think we need to come to a close now, but I wanted to just plug into those South Africans who are perhaps here. This might be a really good basis of doing a comparative study, because when I was growing up, many years ago, there was a Quran printed in South Africa as well. The one that is the 13-line Quran that was because previously we used to bring the Quranic text, printed text from India, and then there was one specifically done in South Africa by a local printer. And I remember the similar issues that were coming up about whether one can have the publishers who are not Muslims, how will they handle the Quran? I don't know how it was done, but I do remember them saying that they had to wear gloves and things like that. So I think this is something that calls for maybe comparative study about how that is, how that tradition is done. I think there's one particular question that is asked by Sonze. If I could just do that as a last question. What is the value of the colors? Are they aesthetic, or are there some mystical connotations and significance? Andrea, if you could respond to that, I think we'll have to close. I was going to ask
through the chat, but I can ask that. And thanks, Asonze. I want to see the colors as the colors of Africa. Red, yellow, and green, the traditional colors of the flags of Africa, plus the black. That's the way I want to see it. But I have to say that my informants were less Pan-Africanist than me. So they have an African passport and I don't. So what I was told by some of the calligraphers is, this is what is like a traditionalist justification. This is what we find in the oldest Quranic manuscripts, which is actually true. The oldest Quranic manuscripts which start to use colors, they have the red and the yellow, perhaps not the green, but they do have the red and the yellow side by side, the black, which has obvious reasons. But I see Dahir is making some moves, so maybe he has a mystical explanation of that.
Yes, I wrote something. The colors in the Quran, the black, you know that we call it baki in Hausa. So baki usually mean that the letter, sometimes in another interpretation, mean the letter. So the Quran letters only written in black color. While some texts that have been added to the Quran, that is not from Quran, like Surah to Masalan, Surah Al-Baqarah, Madani, so should not be written in black because it is not a Quran. So it should be written in red. So to know that this is not Quran. The red one. The red, you can see red and blue, yellow and green in the wasl. So this one to different between Hamzat al-Wasl and Hamzat al-Qata. Anywhere you see the dot of yellow, of green, it means that this Hamza is Hamzat wasl, like in this al-Kafirin, in this page you've shown al-Kafirin. So you see that there are a dot of green on the top of Alif. So that means Hamzat al-Wasl. While the yellow, like in the first line, mean Tilka Ayatullah, show that this yellow mean that the Hamza is Hamzat al-Qata.
So if I can interrupt you, Dahir, you are giving a technical explanation.
Yes.
That basically also means that you are not seeing a mystical meaning. We might come across someone who sees a mystical meaning in this, but I like to think that even if this is not intended, the fact that these Qurans have the colors of most African flags is a nice coincidence, and they can, if we want, take them out of their intention, independently from the intention of those who use these colors, see them as a nice way of visual representation of Islam in Africa, and of Africanness expressed in Islamic terms, because I like to see that coincidence. And
okay, we'll continue that discussion, but I think let me, because I think that we had a really wonderful presentation and a discussion, so I really want to thank first of all Andrea for sharing that with us, and also not keeping to the paper. So you gave us the paper and you gave us something else. So I really appreciate this for this extra without having to pay for it, right? So thank you so much for that. So this is not market logic in a way. So and I also want to thank everybody else, those of you who have had to leave, but also those of you who are still here. Thank you very much for joining us. It's really great to see you, and we will continue this conversation. We'll send you a reminder, but I want to just, you probably know that this is a series of lectures that we're organizing the last Thursday of every month, except for May. But otherwise, we will keep you informed. And the next presentation will be by, it's on a theme that is related. And it's by Dr. Nada Mumtaz, God's Property in Contemporary Beirut. So this is a paper on another dimension of the moral economy. If this was calligraphy and trade, that one is going to be on the waqf, on the idea of waqf, awqaf, or ahbas, that is actually maintains the foundations and such. So we look forward to seeing you, and thank you again, Andrea. Thank you so much for
thanks to you, Abdul Qadir, for inviting me to participate, and to all the audience for listening and for the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll make the video available. Those of you, you'll get a notification about that as soon as you got it ready.